The last speaker before the break represents Britain. Douglas Murray is Associate Director of the Henry Jackson Society. He is an author and also a commentator. And I think it's not wrong to say that you're one of Britain's most outspoken critics of Islamism. We are looking forward to hearing your thoughts on what happened the last 10 years. Welcome, Douglas.
That's on. Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back in Copenhagen. Thank you, my hosts. Thank you, audience, for turning up. I still, by the way, just before I start, should say there's a sort of first principle point one should make, which is one should still register how ludicrous it is that we now talk about the cartoon crisis. And just accept it. People say, 11 years ago, if you'd have said, well, there'll be a big cartoon crisis in Europe in the coming years, people would say, what? It's like a Mickey Mouse atrocity, or a Bugs Bunny outrage. Surreal, but it's what Salman Rushdie said after the Satanic Verses affair. He said, I felt like I'd fallen through the looking glass, and I didn't know if I'd ever get back. We've all fallen through that looking glass in the last 10 years, if not before, but I wanted to talk in this short time I have to you and with you about the question of what have we learned. It's very tempting to say we've learned absolutely nothing in the last 10 years. I just came from London, and just before I left, went to see an exhibition in London which is finishing tomorrow. Some of you will know the organiser. It's called the Passion for Freedom Art Festival. It's now in its 7th year. It's a wonderful art exhibition which does all those things that artists and art curators pretend they do. It actually is about freedom of speech. It's actually about free expression. It's actually about all those things that the art world likes to say it's about. And it's got this year, among other things, the work of a young female Iranian artist who's currently in prison in Iran for her work. It's very moving to see this artwork by a girl imprisoned in Iran exhibited in London on the same road as Buckingham Palace. However, I mention it because of a sadder note. They've always had problems, this exhibition, Passion for Freedom, now in its 7th year. They've always had problems. They had to move galleries several years ago because the gallery owners got scared about the artwork and so on. And it ought to be remembered, of course, it's particular artwork. I mean, there's quite a bit of artwork this year from Ukrainian artists about freedom, quite understandably so. But that's not what bothers the new health and safety, as it were. This year, the exhibition is on Pall Mall in the centre of London, and one of the artworks by a Middle Eastern artist, a female Middle Eastern artist who works under the pseudonym of Mimsy, was withdrawn from the exhibition at the request of the police. Now, the police were shown by the art gallery which this exhibition happens in, were shown the artwork, as it were, to vet the artwork that would go in. And this particular piece, which had been exhibited before, didn't meet the required standards of the British police. And so it was removed. And I don't at all blame the organisers for this, who fought as much of a fight as anyone could and managed to keep other pieces in the exhibition. But of course then there's the secondary one. If you keep this piece in, you'll need security of a bigger magnitude at all of the things, and that's going to cost you. So bit by bit, the language of health and safety meets the language of insurance companies, and it becomes routine that the British police become our art censors. I just about trust the police to catch burglars and stop robbers and muggings. But I don't trust them at all as art critics. And it's bizarre that that is a situation which we've come to. We have come to a situation, as people have said about the Satanic Verses affair, where we've internalised the fatwa. As societies, we've internalised this. And this is one of the things which I think we've learned most clearly from the last 10 years. We've internalised the, absurd to use a phrase still, Mohammed cartoon crisis. But we have learned some things in the last 10 years, and I'll dwell on them for a moment. We've learned, in as clear a way as could possibly have been learned by anybody, that most of the press in free Western countries are cowards. We've learned that most of our artistic establishment are cowards, and that most of our politicians are cowards. We've learned that industries... We've learned that industries that spend much of their year in award ceremonies patting themselves and each other on the back for their bravery stop when an actual act of bravery may be required. We have watched as an entire liberal class of artists and writers and thinkers stop just at the point where bravery is needed. We've learned, once again, for the first time in some centuries in Europe, about blasphemy. Again, if 20 years ago you'd have said the early years of the 21st century in Europe will be dominated by a discussion of blasphemy, people would have said, what? You don't mean repeal of blasphemy laws. You mean, no, actually the discussion about blasphemy. Probably the next thing people would have said was, when did the Spanish Inquisition get back into Europe? How did that happen? No, this is a different type of blasphemy we're talking about. Nobody would have believed you. They'd have thought all of your critical faculties were off, all your prediction mechanisms had gone awry. But that's what the 21st century, not just in Europe, but in a lot of Western countries, is dominated by. Often it's a subterranean conversation. Often it goes above that level. Canada, once again, is debating more blasphemy laws. Mark Stein knows this better than anybody by personal experience, but just recently there is another attempt to impose effectively blasphemy laws in Canada. Of course, it's said that this will only have tried to scoop up the most extreme speech and so on, but no. Already the self-appointed censors in Canada are saying that they're looking forward to prosecuting people who engage in so-called hate speech about Islam. The problem they're going to keep on coming across is the problem of facts. It's going to be deeply disturbing for them, but it'll keep on going. I put it to you, what happens in Canada when the new blasphemy laws are in, even stricter blasphemy laws? What happens when the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa is attacked again by Islamic fundamentalists, as it was last year? What happens? What can the free press say about that? What can they say about the motivations of the attacker? Wouldn't it be better if, in the end, the Canadian judiciary and political system could make sure that no press are able to report an attack on the Canadian Parliament because it's not news? Wouldn't it be easier? They now talk about $10,000 fines on people who transgress the new blasphemy laws. Wouldn't it be easier just to have a direct debit system from the bank accounts of every journalist in case they say something about an attack on the Canadian Parliament that an Islamic terrorist has just carried out? Or should they perhaps not say anything about the motivations? Should they just pretend like President Hollande and other French officials did last December when there were a set of extreme Islamists who in cars drove into French pedestrians shouting Allahu Akbar, and President Hollande and all the other French political leaders pretended these were rather mundane, routine traffic accidents? Will it be easier just to pretend these things away? Well, we've learned some other things in the last 10 years. 5 years ago, almost precisely, we learned from Angela Merkel that multiculturalism had failed. 4 years ago, we learned the same thing from President Sarkozy and from Prime Minister Cameron. It's not clear exactly what they meant by that. In fact, as was alluded to earlier, it becomes curiouser and curiouser. It's very strange looking back. What did they mean by that? If multiculturalism was integration, among other things, which was one of the things that Angela Merkel seemed exercised by, why would multiculturalism have failed when migration was at a relatively low point, but it would be just fine when migration was at a higher point than it's ever been in our history? Why would integration not work when migration is relatively low, but we'll have to keep quiet when it's a lot higher? This isn't clear to me, and I'm sure it's not clear to very many of you. We learned a lot of other things. We learned that our politicians are incredibly good at dealing with secondary problems. Let me give you a couple of examples. Whenever anything has happened in Europe of any popular attempt to register discontent about the weakness of our political elites, the politicians have been incredibly good at coming down on that secondary reaction. So in the UK, when somebody called Tommy Robinson started a movement called the English Defence League, I didn't agree with it, I didn't like what it did, but he started this. It was a movement, a street protest movement. When he started that, very soon afterwards, his own house was raided by police, his family's houses were raided by police, computers were taken away, and they managed to get him to prison on a mortgage fraud case. They sifted through everything in him, in his background, everything in his life, everything in his family's life. They found something, he went to prison. Mortgage fraud is bad, don't get me wrong. But it seemed rather obvious to some of us that the reason he was in prison was not because of the mortgage fraud, but because he was a problem, and people, particularly our politicians, wanted that problem to go away. My point about this is, Tommy Robinson, the EDL, was a secondary symptom of a problem. They were the result of politicians rightly being seen not to have done anything with the primary problem. And the question some of us have kept on asking is, if you could do that with that person who caused you a problem, why couldn't you do it with the people that person was objecting to? Why couldn't you send the police into the houses of every extreme Islamist mullah in Britain, every radical preacher in Britain? I can bet some of them have got some dodgy mortgage stuff on the books. I can bet you'll get some of them on a technicality to do with something they've done once. But that's not the aim. The aim is to go to the secondary problem. Another example, Chancellor Merkel in her New Year message on the Pegida protests. I don't agree with the Pegida protests particularly. That's not the point. It is a legitimate movement of people saying that they dislike some of the things that are happening in their country. But that is not... their primary concern was not what Angela Merkel was concerned about. She and the entire administration of her government turns on the reaction to the problem. So in her New Year's message she says that the Pegida protesters have coldness in their hearts. Why does she not say the Islamists who the Pegida protesters are concerned about have the most incredible coldness in their hearts? That is our primary problem. We must be careful as Germans not to have too much coldness in our own hearts, but that is the problem. No, we have a political class that believes that you can solve these problems by dealing with the secondary symptoms. It is like going to a body racked with disease and solving a skin inflammation. This is a magnificent problem of our time, the inability to grapple with the primary problem. We've learned other things, though, of course. We learned in January this year that absolutely everybody seemed to be Charlie. We learned that Mahmoud Abbas was Charlie. We learned that every politician who has spent the last 10 years calling cartoonists inflammatory and Islamophobic and right-wing and fundamentalists and Enlightenment fundamentalists and troublemakers and so on, was Charlie for about an hour. Because we learned very soon after that almost nobody was Charlie. We learned in the end, sadly, that even Charlie wasn't Charlie when earlier this year, perfectly understandably, surviving members of the staff of Charlie Hebdo said they didn't want to keep drawing Mohammed. We've learned other things. We've learned, I would submit, in the last 10 years how incredibly slowly our societies crawl towards truths which should be self-evident. We have spent the last 10 years still going round the circumlocution of whether or not Islam is a religion of peace. We have had so many variations on this circumlocution now, and I keep a small notebook that's pretty much filled with them. My favourite is the movement from this terrorist attack has nothing to do with Islam to it has nothing to do with Islam, and Islam is in any case a religion of peace, to Barack Obama's best hit ever, which came last year after an American hostage was decapitated in Syria. And Barack Obama said, it not only doesn't have anything to do with Islam, it has less to do with Islam than any other religion. So, if somebody cuts off someone's head while shouting Allahu Akbar, the Buddhists should get it. long before anybody else, long before the Quakers should have it coming to them. Anyhow, we've learned that it's incredibly slow, our movement towards the truth. But let me give you one, sorry it's early in the day and this is another very graphic example. Let me give you one example of how bad that slow movement towards the truth is. 30 years ago in my country, we had legislation put in place to make it illegal to carry out female genital mutilation. To date, there has not been one prosecution for this that's been successful. It took, indeed, until a couple of years ago to have any attempted prosecution for female genital mutilation. There have been, as I say, this has been on the statute books for 30 years, and tens of thousands of British girls have been mutilated in this way. Now, I remember 14 years ago or so when Ayaan Hirsi Ali started speaking about this in Holland and others started speaking about it in Scandinavia and elsewhere. I remember about 10 years ago I published a report on FGM in the UK. Throughout most of this time, this was still a culturally sensitive, as they say, subject to talk about. And it was a difficult one. You could feel it as you mentioned it in public. In the last few years, it's become a bit easier. The Evening Standard in Britain ran a campaign against FGM. The Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, joined the campaign. All sorts of politicians from across the political spectrum came out in support of the campaign against FGM. Let me put it to you like this. If you were to select a subject which should be the easiest subject in the world to get total political and popular support for, does anything get easier than saying we are against the mutilation of young girls' genitals with knives? I can't think of anything. That should be as easy as it gets. It should be a home run. And it's taken 30 years to even get it to being a legitimate political conversation, and one which has still had no practical repercussions. That, I would suggest, is a sign that if we are learning, we're really slow learners. Now, I would say, as I come to wrapping up, it doesn't have to be like this, and it never did have to be like this. There are always signs, there are always occasional flickers and glimmers of hope. I thought that your Prime Minister, Rasmussen, gave us one such glimmer early on in the cartoon crisis, when a delegation of alleged community leaders said they wanted to see him about it. And he said, of my understanding, he said that he wouldn't see them because they would have to learn that in Denmark was a free society with a government that was separate from the free press, and these things were separate, and that the sooner these people learned that, the better. We could have done that. We could have done a lot more of that. We could have had a lot less kowtowing. We could have had a lot more basic standing up for our own principles. But by and large, we failed. If I may, I would say there is an important aspect to the British tradition of free speech in this regard, and it's the one I know most about, so you'll pardon me if I'm not mentioning Danish philosophers for the moment. But the British principle of freedom of speech was always, it's not a right, it's not something you are born with and it comes from nowhere. It's a necessity, and it's a necessity to keep a society free. Because the reason why free speech in the British tradition came about, through Milton, Mill and others, was that you had to hear dissident voices, you had to hear contrary opinions, because only if you could hear those opinions and allowed yourself to hear them and to read them and to see them and to view them, could you first of all work out if you yourself were in error. If you were in error, it would strengthen the truth which you held by hearing a contrary opinion. But also, it was possible, and it remains possible today, that contrary opinion, that minority opinion against the overwhelming consensus of your time, might turn out to be right. And if it does turn out to be right, you should not disable yourself from being able to hear it, from being able to read it, from being able to see it. That's why freedom of speech matters. It's because it's the only way we have to avoid error. And that is why what has happened in the last 10 years, and the intimidation and the attempt to shut debate down by people who come in through the front door with Kalashnikovs and cowardly, cringing officials and others who come through the back door with legislation and so on, are so much part of this problem. Because we need to hear this contrary opinion, because it may just be the case, and I submit to you that it is, that what has been seen to be the contrary opinion in recent years was the opinion that was right, which is that there is a problem, and something about which we should be concerned, and which is going on in our society, and that we would like to stop it. Now, in wrapping up, I would just say this. It seems to me that the thing I've certainly learned most in the last 10 years is this. Freedom never was a very popular idea. It's serious. You look back in history, at almost any phase, not just the mid-20th century, which is all anyone seems to know about these days, but almost any period in history. Most people weren't bothered particularly about freedom. They wanted security, and they wanted safety, and they wanted a comfortable and an easy life, and they wanted to be cosy. Freedom of speech was only ever defended by a few people, just as freedom in general was only ever defended by a few people. But maybe it only ever needed a few people. One of the proudest things of my life in recent years has been coming to Denmark, making some very good friends here, of getting to know Lars, Fleming, Hella, and a whole set of other people who are among the few people. There were some in America, some in Canada, one or two in Britain, a few on the continent. But I would say, in wrapping up, that one of the things I think you could be proudest of is that when the history of this era is written, and it will be written, and I'm more optimistic than Henrik, that when it does come to be written, the name of Denmark will be able to be talked about with enormous pride. Thank you.
Questions, comments for Douglas? We have 10 minutes only.
Yes?
Please, get up.
I was thinking about how this migration crisis is hitting every European country, how it will affect free speech since they will become citizens of the nation they are right to, and therefore being able to vote, they can perhaps influence the legislation in those countries, perhaps move against free speech. How do you see that happening?
Well, it will happen. I mean, I think one of the most important points and original points in Fleming Rose's book on the cartoon crisis was the point he makes about the fact that there seems to be an assumption in our societies that the more pluralistic a society becomes, the less we should say. In other words, the more opinion, as it were, is out there and possible to be out there, the more we need to dampen down and lower the ceiling of what is permissible. Of course, the opposite is the truth. The opposite is the truth, which is that with a very pluralistic society, you're going to have to hear more voices than ever. I would say that I'm not confident about us pushing back against this well, but if there were one thing in the whole crisis, the migration crisis, that I would signal, it would be this. I think we have a deep problem here. It's a subject for me for another day, but I have a long piece in the current issue of Standpoint magazine. It's online if you're interested. But I would say this. People who come as refugees, legitimate refugees, as opposed to economic migrants, it seems to me we will miss a very important opportunity if we don't say one thing in particular to them as an agreement before they come, which is this. Islam is, to a very great extent, not entirely, but to a very great extent, what has screwed up the countries they're fleeing from. Sectarianism, the extremist interpretations, all that sort of thing is to a very great extent what has screwed up the countries they're fleeing from. So in order to come into our countries, as a bare minimum, they should realise that that is the case, and that when they come into our countries, They are not to spend a significant amount of their time trying to repeat the experiment of the thing that made them flee before. I don't know how you do it, but I think it's got to be there somewhere. The gentleman there.
Yeah, I think he will.
Talk loud, that's all right.
No, just wait a minute.
Okay.
I can hear you, but posterity will not. So,
Thanks for having me in the United States. I, like many others, was followed to learn on Sunday. The New York Times was an article published that our United States Army, we had a captain of the United States military base in Afghanistan, comes to find out that a local Taliban commander, not Taliban, Afghan army commander, allied against the Taliban, was raping a young boy. And this is endemic to the culture there. And the United States military, upon finding out that this captain took matters into his own hands to put stop to this, he was punished for his actions. This to me seems like an issue you alluded to, female genital mutilation. It should be something that we can also rally against just as easily. What does that say to you? Do you think this is also part of the same problem with this sensitivity towards Islam? What does that say about the Western self-confidence we can stand against this?
it's the usual thing, isn't it? I mean, the tolerance is a one-way street. We have to walk so far down the avenue of tolerance that, you see some elderly guy raping a kid. You go, oh, well, if it's their culture, then who are we to say? Maybe historically somebody in our culture raped, so we shouldn't feel so smug and so on. But all the time, of course, this points to, yes, a very, very fundamental problem. A problem of self-confidence, among other things. If I give you one more, ludicrous example of that, God, I could go on. But take the example a few years ago, the American military commander in Afghanistan. Do you remember this? Was it McChrystal at the time? Anyhow, the American military commander, the most senior commander in Afghanistan, and there is a report that some Qurans had been mishandled in some corner of Afghanistan by some American troops and had been handled in the wrong way, and their infidel hands had touched the Quran. Cue the predictable riots and so on. The American military commander in Afghanistan is on the television within hours, announcing that he was woken up in the middle of the night with the news that some Qurans had been mishandled. It was like it sounded like the sort of the red alert button you might have for an incoming nuclear strike. I discovered in the middle of the night that there had been an inappropriate handling of a Quran, and I can assure you that we have cleared up the situation, punished the people responsible, and it will never happen again. This seemed to me to be a video more akin to somebody suing for peace at the end of a battle that they'd lost than that of a confident military commander. But as I say, all of our institutions have got their own crises.
Yes, we got 3 questions more.
Hello, my name is Tommy Hoiber. I have a question regarding the UK, because in countries like Denmark, Sweden, other European countries, we have political parties where you can vote if you are not satisfied with the way immigrants come to Europe. Do you have a similar organization in the UK, because the political system is a little different over there?
A political party you could vote for that would be against, yeah. Well, look, every country's voting system is always awful to the people in the country, and they all admire every other country's voting system until they go to that country, and then they see that that's terrible too in some other way. And the British system is very static. It's very hard for new parties to break through. The UK Independence Party has done quite a lot. It's broken through at the European Parliament level, of course, so it's now the fringe minority party which happens to have the most MEPs in the UK. But in the UK Parliament, it's not at all easy, and there's only one UKIP MP rather, and they didn't break through at the last election for all sorts of tedious, reasons. But it's a massive problem when the entirety of the political class is effectively of one mind on a subject. And public opinion is completely the other way. Look at any recent poll. 7% of the British public, only 7% want more immigration. 13% of the British public in a recent poll showed were born abroad. So most people who are immigrants to the UK don't want more immigrants. And no political party among the mainstream political parties in Parliament answers that voice. So for the meantime, we've got to accept that the majority opinion is a wild, wacky minority opinion that shouldn't be listened to, and that the majority is the problem.
I was wondering what your views are on failures of universities to sort of foster free speech and open debates, and what its sort of implications are for wider society.
Why? Yes, university free speech is a great one, but I could go on. The number of times that anyone engaged in free speech has been cancelled from campus now, I mean, it sort of happens every week. We get used to it, you know. We have radicals who go around, university campuses recruiting jihadists and so on, and that's fine. If, for instance, you're Omar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib from UCL, University College London, and you run big days where you bring terrorists into campus and you show everyone footage of the planes flying into the Twin Towers, that's free speech. But somebody saying, I don't like that, hate speech. So, universities are the worst. Of course they're the worst. They always were going to be. I mean, I'd go to a university professor to get their ideas on this long after a gardener or a bin collector or anyone else. The universities are so much part of the problem, because so much of this, the problem is the thought disease. I mean, our thinking has gone bad in Europe, it seems to me. And so the centres of so-called learning are no such thing. Let me give a very, very quick example, if I may. A few years ago at a university in London, some students came to me and said their student newspaper was going to run a cartoon of Muhammad, and I think did. The Student Islamic Society leader said that the names of the editors of this student newspaper had appeared on an Al-Qaeda website, you see. This caused a huge furore among the university and so on. Of course, the thing was withdrawn. But then the Student Islamic Society leader said, to the kids who allegedly have done this, if you apologise, I can see if I can mediate a bit, sort of thing. That is the thing that is happening all the time. All the time. The people with Kalashnikovs don't have to be very large in number, because behind them they have a whole group of people who find it very useful that they have people with Kalashnikovs on their side. And you can go a long way if you can say, basically, I'm not the old, mob trick. You turn up at somebody's door with a huge bouncer in black glasses and you say, well, I'm not going to hurt you, but my mate, he's mad as hell at you. It's incredibly effective. And in the end, by the way, before the last question, in the end, that will catch, because other people will get that idea. And they'll think, we could do with a few people with Kalashnikovs who just showed some urgency on our side, and think what we could achieve. I've always said I feel sorry as hell for the Sikh community in Britain. They have never had any massive influxes of government funding or so on. I mean, a few years ago when some Sikh leaders came to me and pointed out, we always get the flack for all the Muslims not integrating and all that sort of thing. What would you recommend? I stress jokingly said, why don't you get 4 guys to blow up the London Underground? Because, as I say, it was a joke, and they did not follow my opinion. This is not hate speech. But, you see the point? One final, I said...
Thank you, Dr. Murray, for your great black sense of humor. We make the correct analysis, we use reason, and we are losing. Right now, maybe on turn, but right now we're losing all the way around. I'm really stunned that you tell us that there are only 2 or 3 people like you in Britain. I hope not. But my question to you is, are we there where we must realize that there will be violence? We must be able to defend ourselves. Has the time come to teach our young boys, our young men, that they must be able to use a weapon, and they must be able to stand up for their families.
No, I don't think that's where we are. But I would say this on all this. I wouldn't be so downhearted about, as it were, the situation one is in. Now, as I say, I'm not either an optimist or a pessimist. I think these things are attitudes. You can wake up one morning feeling optimistic. You can go to a dinner in the evening feeling pessimistic. These things come and go. But one thing I would say is this. The other side have got a hell of a PR problem. And this might just become clearer in the years ahead. Whilst our politicians almost all say, there are obviously notable exceptions, the same things, the public opinion polls show the public are thinking quite different things. Look at polls in France or Germany about people's views about Islam as a whole. 70% of French people in a recent poll saying that Islam is incompatible with French society. 70%. Now, I would submit that this is one of the most interesting and problematic things going on. That the divide has grown very, very large. Now, I would say that that divide is bridgeable. And it's bridgeable by decent mainstream politicians, as there are some across the continent now, filling that gap. Because let me put it this way, I've said for a long time to politicians in the UK, you have a real problem, because the public can see something very, very clearly. They don't like being blown up, they don't like cartoonists being shot, they don't like young girls being abducted, and so on. They don't like these things. And you, in the meantime, are saying it has nothing to do with this culture or this religion. And I always put it this way when I get a chance to speak to a politician. Let's look a couple of years down the line, and let's pretend that something happened like something that was attempted several times in the last decade. Let's say that an Islamist cell manages to blow up a women's nightclub on, a nightclub on Women's Night. This was tried. There have been people sent to prison for trying this. One in the centre of London 8 years ago. They said, they put the bomb outside the ladies' night on a nightclub and said, who could feel any sympathy for these slags all dancing around? Now look, when that happens, if that happens, God knows, we hope it doesn't, but there are lots of people always trying to do it. When at a northern nightclub on ladies' night or something like that, the bomb goes off, and there's dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of maimed young girls, the British Prime Minister cannot come out the next day and say this has nothing to do with Islam, because nobody believes him anymore. And therein lies a massive democratic problem for our countries and a massive problem of legitimacy for our political class. My view is they have to spend the coming years, and they could, changing their position on this, facing up to what is in front of all of us, bridging that gap, and making sure that the response of European societies to this huge problem, when it comes, is a decent response. Thank you.